Hi there.
You look so cute. I love it.
How do you like my sukkah?
It's great. It's so great.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to wait another minute and let people in and give people a couple of, so we have right now, we have like 12 on the waiting list. I want to see if, do you guys now find it make more sense to give people to do the waiting room or to do a password so people can just get in?
Really depends on the meeting. I try to do passwords because then you don't miss anybody. I find that sometimes you just like don't pay attention and then.
Okay, I'm gonna wait another, I'm gonna let everyone in. All right, so I'm just gonna give a few words of introduction and hand it over to you, Rowan, right? And are your people, where are your people? Who's your people? So I let them in.
Baha, Daron.
Meshi yours? I don't see.
Meshi is, but she's not speaking today. Do you see Hadar?
I do, admit.
Daron.
Daron, yeah.
Baha.
I don't see Baha.
Okay, Marah.
Yes. All right, hi everyone. As soon as I'm gonna let everyone in a second, and then I'm just gonna give a short introduction and hand it over to Rowan. Is Tariq? No, Tariq is not Baha. I'm looking for Baha.
Yeah.
Not seeing Baha yet. All right, I'm gonna admit all and get us started. How's that? All right, awesome.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Ruti Kadish, and I am the National Director of Communal Engagement at J Street, and it is a thrill to be here in our Sukkah with you today. I'm just going to wait as people are, I have to let in the waiting room, so I'm just going to wait another minute to let people in, and then we'll get started. People are still coming in, so I don't want to lose the waiting room or forget the waiting room. So, but I think Shana, if you're on, I think you're able to let people in the waiting room if I don't see it. So, all right, everyone, welcome. Good afternoon and welcome to our virtual J Street Sukkah. I'm delighted to have, I'm not sitting in, this is a virtual background, but that is a sukkah that I did sit in, and I'm glad to have it as the background today. And thank you all for joining us. This program is co-hosted by Trua, and we're always delighted to partner. And this is another opportunity for us to think about our J Street issues in the context of the holiday, the Jewish holiday, as well as to think about the holiday in the context of our issues of advancing social justice and democracy and self-determination for Israelis and Palestinians. And today I'm really delighted to have our Ushpizin, our special guest with us, New Story Leadership, whom I've had the pleasure of working with. Sorry, I'm looking at the list here, the admit list. I've had the pleasure of working with and getting to know Rowan and Maya and Anna really well, and and meeting every year, meeting their delegates, and they really inspire a tremendous amount of hope in me. And in the theme of some of our publications, which you may have seen this holiday that we've put out about developing empathy and compassion and really being able to see the other and listen to each other, I was delighted to be able to, that New Story Leadership is able to join us today and share their stories and help us in that practice of really seeing the other and developing compassion and empathy, and which I believe is a necessary component to making progress toward our goals of solving the conflict and getting to justice. So I am happy to turn it over to Rowan, and she will take it from here.
Thank you, Ruti, so much for the introduction, for welcoming us and bringing our New Story Leadership delegates to speak to the audience today. And thank you all for joining in. I know sometimes we look at the news and we see the politics and the decisiveness in the current moment in the region and in the United States, and it can get a little hopeless sometimes. But what New Story Leadership believes is that we want to give a voice to the younger generation. And we believe that in politics, the personal stories are missing. And that's core to the values that we bring, and it'll be core to this event. We want you to listen to the personal stories of Palestinians and Israelis, young Palestinians and Israelis that are living right now in the region, and the decisions that policymakers are making every day are affecting their lives. And we believe it's time to give them the spotlight. Before we begin our event and introduce our speakers, my partner, Anna, who's the Israeli co-director, will give you all a quick overview of what New Story Leadership does. Anna?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Just to briefly introduce NSL, what we do is we bring 5 Israelis, 5 Palestinians to a summer program in DC, and we focus on advocating on Capitol Hill and audiences around the DMV area, because as Rowan said, we believe that our voices are missing. Both Rowan and I are alums of the program, so we feel the responsibility to continue and do that every year. The other thing that we do, we make sure that our delegates live with American host families, because it's also a key part. Last summer, unfortunately, we were not able to invite our delegates to DC, but we were able to do a digital program, and the people you will hear from today were the participants. So yeah, I'll hand it over back to Rowan to introduce everybody.
Thank you, Anna. And now I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Doron. Doron is an Israeli that was raised in Israel and currently lives in Jerusalem. He has a master's degree from political science at the Hebrew University, and he currently works on Israel-Palestine partnership programs with the German Foundation Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Doron, I hope I pronounced it right. Everyone, please welcome Doron.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, and happy holidays for everyone. So when I think about empathy and what shaped me and my values the most, it is my family and people history of the Holocaust. My grandparents both survived, and I, as a child, was very interested and curious to know everything about it. I was always learning and reading intensively about the war, and my grandmother used to tell me about her time in the ghetto and the concentration camp. When the war broke out, her father sent a cart to take her from the city into the village. but her friends jumped into her cart and took her place. So she told them, go out or go without me. And so luckily, because of this, I mean, she didn't go on this cart, and everyone in the village was shot dead, but she survived the first day of the war. As I grew older, she was telling me much harder stories, even things she hasn't told anyone else. In one of the Holocaust movies I watched, and I watched many of them, there was a sentence that struck me and influenced me for the years to come. It was Captain Gilbert who said, "Work, I was searching for the nature of evil, and now I think I have come close to defining it, a lack of empathy, a genuine incapacity to feel with the fellow man. Evil, I think, is the absence of empathy." This is what he said in the movie. When I was young, I started to become politically involved and aware of the injustices that my people are inflicting on others, mainly the Palestinians who live under Israeli military rule. And I understood that empathy is essential to any political direction I might take. Around that time, the Second Intifada is broken out, and I felt empathy with the Palestinians and their aspiration to live in freedom. On daily discussions and arguments with schoolmates, teachers, relatives, and even strangers, I always used to take the side of the Palestinians and defend their cause. This empathy caused me a lot of inconvenience, as I was tagged immediately a traitor, an Arab lover, and a self-hating Jew. People couldn't understand how I have more empathy towards my enemies than towards my people. But my empathy was important, but rather hollow, without really knowing the people I empathize with. So I started to learn Arabic in order to understand and communicate with Arabs in general and Palestinians in particular. When I finished high school, I knew that I must go to the army, but I did not want to serve in the West Bank and Gaza Strip and to become a tool of the occupation. Because I knew Arabic, the Israeli intelligence had offered me the most advanced Arabic course in order to be a soldier in the intelligence of the IDF. I agreed to take the course, and after almost 5 months of studying Arabic thoroughly, 2 people from a secret unit came to interview me for another position. During this interview, they asked me whether I would have a problem to serve in the occupied territories. Of course, they didn't say occupied. And I replied that I would refuse to do this because I'm against controlling another people. They were shocked and told me that I cannot say this. I replied that I only answered their question. The interview was obviously immediately over. Luckily, because of this interview and my ethical objection, I wasn't sent to the Israeli intelligence, but positioned as an Arabic and Islam teacher for soldiers and civilians, where I had the liberty to teach whatever I wanted, like poems of Palestinian national poet Mahmoud Darwish. After the army, I began my studies in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and I had to move to a city which is much more conservative, nationalist, and religious than the place I grew up in. At first, it was very hard for me to live among people who value only their own rights and disregard the rights of the other side. But after years of living in Jerusalem and interacting with them, I could finally understand where they are coming from, and I started to question myself how their needs can be accommodated and reconciled with the Palestinian aspirations. On the holiday of Sukkot now, we eat and sleep in semi-tents to commemorate the times when we were nomads without a land, homeless and stateless. Some would argue that in this holiday, we should empathize with the poor and disadvantaged of this world. But empathy is only the ability to feel what the other feels, and as an emotion, it is insufficient without a complementary action to improve the conditions and rights of the underprivileged. Empathy is merely the ability to put oneself in someone else's shoes. The radical empathy is to put yourself in the mind and perception of someone who thinks differently than you. It is much harder to start your ethical contemplation from the needs and concerns of someone else and see how you can change your mind in accordance. It might break some dogmas and paradigms that you used to believe in, but this is exactly the outcome of radical empathy. In the context of Israel-Palestine, it means to begin searching for solutions that take into account the needs and concerns of Israelis and Palestinians and to challenge the prescribed solutions that have disregarded them so far. We live in times of severe political polarization when people don't listen nor discuss anymore with their opponents. An act of radical empathy would be to invite a person you disagree with to your metaphoric sukkah. Over food and drinks, it is much more pleasant to engage in a meaningful discussion. Don't try to convince and preach them, but rather listen to what they say. Ask them questions and seed doubts in their minds. Being empathetic to your opponents might change them reciprocally. I would like to finish my story with a poem of my favorite poet, Yehuda Amichai. It's called The Place Where We Are Right, and it goes like this. From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard. But doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plow, and a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood. Thank you for listening to me.
Daron, thank you so much for your for your story and for reminding us what radical empathy represents for you. I will now ask Marah to share her story. Marah is a Palestinian citizen of Israel, born and raised in Nazareth. She is currently a graduate student of sociology, focusing on equality and distributional justice at Tel Aviv University. Marah is passionate about bringing justice and moving people to action. Marah?
Thank you, and thank everyone for having us today. Chag Sameach. My story is a little bit sad, or I don't know, it reflects how I'm feeling in the past few days. So with my many attempts to ignore it over the years, I finally realized that I must face it and not run away from it. Simply put, I was born on the wrong side of the conflict. My name is Marah, and I am a Palestinian with an Israeli citizenship. In the past few years living in Tel Aviv and having mostly Jewish friends, I have learned that very few people accept my identity and who I am as a Palestinian. In the worst cases, I am faced with angry backlashes in conversations, telling me that I'm only an Arab, and if I consider myself Palestinian, then there's no space for me in this place, in this country, and that I should move to Gaza. In the best cases, I would face gentle and calm attempts to rationale with me and convince me that there is no such thing as a Palestinian people, and that this group of people have come from Jordan anyways. This identity is not rejected by individuals only. It is not so much accepted officially by the state either. Many people have taken it for granted, and probably you did too, that Israel is a Jewish state and claims to be democratic, though such a declaration should not be taken lightly or casually. Here in Israel, many have told me that I don't deserve equality or don't deserve the right to fight for my equality because others have it worse. You know, because Syrians have lost their country in war. I don't deserve to demand equality in my home because the Palestinians in Lebanon are still refugees, or because other Arabs don't live in democratic countries. I don't deserve to demand equality in my home. After all, I should be grateful that I live in Israel and not anywhere else where women are considered servants for their husbands. As a Palestinian, and from my people's experience firsthand as a citizen, I tell you, Israel does not treat us as full citizens, and we're not equals to Jews in the land. What is commonly said is true to us. Israel is democratic to the Jews, but is Jewish to the Palestinians. You might be thinking to yourself, how dare I claim this? Or not understand why I'm even saying this. After all, I get the right to vote in the Knesset elections, right? Well, identity in Israel is tantamount to life chances. Many doors are deemed shut in my face because of my identity. As Arabs, we are facing a glass ceiling that is only visible to us and invisible to others. An Arab may be an excellent surgeon at a hospital, but she cannot be the chief executive of it. An Arab may be a judge, but the country would flip and the media discourse will be full of controversies that erupt when an Arab judge is chosen for the higher court of justice. An Arab may well be excellent in every aspect of their life, working hard, just like I do in university, but will always be stopped, hindered, like getting lower grades on my paper because I'm too political or too radical and biased to my teacher's taste. Now you see, structurally built, the state discriminates against all those who are not Jewish. It may be obvious that symbolically and culturally the state does not represent my identity, but it further disregards it and over time has been trying to erase it from memory. And since Israel is the nation state of the Jews, it exists to exclusively serve the Jews. As the nation state bill clearly states, only the Jews get the right for self-determination in the land, disregarding our existence as Palestinians. Arabic language is stepped down from being an official language, the mother tongue of over 20% of the citizenry of the state. The law deems Jewish settlement as national value and encourages the continuous displacement of Palestinians and the grabbings of our lands. This basic law, which requires more than a normal majority to change, writes discrimination as legal in the laws of the state. We have seen this happen before in history, and history, unfortunately, tends to repeat itself. Maybe this still does not explain to you where I'm coming from. But in order to explain a little bit more how this affects my life, I will tell examples from the news in a time declared as emergency. When the pandemic first broke out, the health ministry did not publish the relevant materials in Arabic. All of the instructions and rules were not published in Arabic and were not transferred through the right channels to the Arab population. And the ministry delayed the translation process until they eventually did. And still then, the translation was not comprehensible. Therefore, in a personal initiative, Palestinian citizens of Israel translated the materials into Arabic and worked on spreading it out in the Arab community. Then, when the testing stations were constructed, no single testing station was set in an area which serves the Arab population of the state. More than 20% of the citizens had no access to health services which are intended to stop the spreading of the virus. Yet again, in a personal initiative, the Palestinian Knesset members in Israel assembled a group of people to serve our community and set up testing stations and prepared our hospitals for treating patients, all done from communal donations. When these citizens are paying taxes and contributing to building the economy of the state like every other citizen, the government turns its back on them in times of crisis because apparently their lives are not important enough. They're not Jewish after all. The COVID-19 breakout in Israel is coming closer to resemble the ethnic and national disparities in poverty, crime, and health. This is not good news, but it is not new either. This is normal for us to witness. The government and official bodies in Israel in the normal days do not serve equally on all fronts for all citizens, and we shouldn't be surprised to see them discriminate against us in times of emergency. What matters after all is which side you're on. Are you Jewish? If the answer is yes, you get to live in a democracy. If not, well, I was told that I have 22 Arab countries for my disposal to immigrate to, right? Thank you.
Marah, thank you so much for sharing. Next, I'd like to ask Hadar to share her story with us today. Hadar lives in Tel Aviv and has a bachelor's degree from Tel Aviv University in Islam and Gender Studies. She was the coordinator of the War of Sexual Violence Lobby Organization and co-producer of the Israel Slut Walk in Tel Aviv. She is a feminist activist and vegan cook. Hadar.
Hi, everyone. I feel like I have to apologize because Marah always gets me crying. I have to affirm everything she says. These things that she's talking about are things that I heard myself, and I'll tell you why. I'm an Israeli citizen from Tel Aviv, and I was raised in an Orthodox nationalist right-wing family and grew up in a settlement called Shaare Tikva. I went to the girls' school at a settlement nearby where I was taught a very specific kind of narrative, exactly the one that Marah was talking about. My education was mostly to reinforce our entitlement to live in this area You know how each Jewish holiday reminds us of the biblical stories where we were hunted and prosecuted. So that was topped off with Holocaust stories. Well, the main argument was always the same. We need a nation state so that no one would be able to kick us out from our houses. The settlement is surrounded by a fence with military patrol around it. The adults around me always explained to us that it was there for our safety, so that no terrorists would come close. There's a Palestinian village called Azunatme, that parts of it were really close to the settlement. And as I used to walk home from school, there was a young boy who stood on the hill right in front of the street that I was standing in. And he used to flip his finger towards me. Sometimes I would wave back or shout something. It was like a game, because that was the only form of communication we could have. I wasn't afraid of him. He was just a little boy. I got curious about their life behind the fence. Growing older, I left the settlement and started university. For the first time in a secular education institution, I started learning things that contrast what I've been taught my whole life so far. For example, I learned that during the 50s, Israel used a very old legislation trick that nationalized all the Palestinian property after the 48 war and gave it to new immigrants, Jewish people that made Aliyah. I started hearing stories from my Palestinian classmates telling me their grandparents' memories of the houses they left and the life that shifted in such a horrible way and turned them to refugees. Needless to say, I was appalled to discover that my nation did exactly what was done to us after the Holocaust. Still, families can't go back to their homes just like then. After learning this piece of history, I couldn't normalize or ignore the occupation. I realized that living in a settlement behind the fence was not to protect us. It was to separate us from sharing our stories. Because once you do share your story, it's almost impossible to not have empathy. When we talk today about radical empathy, I feel like Palestinians already have mine, but the ones that really comes to my mind concerning radical empathy are my family members and so many of the people that I considered educators that are still settlers. Here in NSL, we joined together Israelis and Palestinians to discuss painful issues. It's not always easy to hear each other's side, but we are here to listen. My family won't even discuss this with me. And every conversation I have about these kind of issues with my dad or my grandma ends up in tears, because even though they are the people who raised me, they're also super racist when it comes to Palestinians. I often have to remind myself it took me a lot of effort, self-education, and time to be able to leave my community and join the struggle against occupation. And without the people I've met and the stories I've heard, I wouldn't be able to do so. But since I did it, I'm hopeful others can also make this transition. I believe that information opens our eyes, stories opens our hearts, so that empathy will bring us eventually together. I wish us all happy holidays, and may we celebrate together as each other's guests in the future. Thank you.
Hadar, thank you so much for sharing your story and bringing your truth to us today. Our final speaker is going to be Baha. Baha is a Palestinian refugee from the occupied village of Beit Natif and is currently living in the city of Beit Jala. He has since graduated at Al-Quds Bard College, where he studied international law and human rights. Baha, please share your story with us.
Hi everyone. My name is Baha Ibdir. Yes, I'm an Arab, but more importantly, I'm a Palestinian with an individual story, identity, and history. I live in the West Bank, but I'm not from the West Bank. I currently live in the city of Beit Jala, but I'm not from Beit Jala. Most of my relatives live in Aida refugee camp, but I'm not from the refugee camp. I'm originally from the occupied village of Beit Natif, the place that my grandparents were forcefully displaced from in 1948. Many assume that just because I don't live in the refugee camp, this means that I have given up on my right of return to my own village. But what they seem to forget is that the daily reality of coming eye to eye with watchtowers, segregating walls, and restrictive checkpoints make me long for return even more. In 1933, there was a bus that would take people from my village of Beit Natif to Haifa, Jaffa, and Jerusalem. They did not have to cross any checkpoints back then. Today, Haifa and Jaffa are no more than fantasies that I indulge in. As for Jerusalem, getting a permit for my US visa appointment is my only excuse to walk around the city in the remaining few hours of my soon-to-be expired permit. Today, I cannot even go to my university without crossing a checkpoint every single time. My everyday life is full of uncertainty. In my reality, whether I wake up at 5:30 or 7 for my 8 a.m. class, there is no guarantee that I will make it on time to my class. Buses are randomly stopped and checkpoints get closed suddenly, as if we did not have lives, dreams, and plans awaiting us like normal people. So what does it mean for Palestinians to cross checkpoints every day? These checkpoints often harm our bodies and brains without directly touching our bodies and brains. The checkpoint is a place where laughter is suppressed and the music is turned off. It is a place where we have to put our happiness and sadness on pause, or they would be mistaken for a security threat. The checkpoint prevents us from making human mistakes and from moving freely in our own land. The checkpoint is a place where normal car accidents are synonymous with suspected attacks. It is a place where drivers are shot to death rather than given a speeding ticket. No matter if Palestinians intend to cause harm or not, they're treated as inherently violent and dangerous. At checkpoints, they are treated as suspects first and potential criminals second. The checkpoint is a place where I'm constantly forced to feel guilty and traumatized for my own existence. So I asked myself, what did I do? Checkpoints remind me every morning that I'm constantly being watched and reminded of my human worth in relation to others. It is meant to make me internalize my otherness and never question it. But here I am, questioning it and rejecting it. When I was living in New York City for a semester during my studies, I remembered how my parents back home would tell me that I can always thrive and succeed despite the occupation. But living in New York showed me that I can thrive, succeed, and achieve even more without the occupation. During my first week in New York, I get confused while trying to navigate the city through the subway. At every stop, I expected the soldier to check me, question me, or interrogate me, but nobody did. I would wake up at 8:30 for my 9:30 internship, even though a morning commute in New York could be very tricky. It was the first time I unapologetically experienced self-autonomy and self-determination at once. People of all colors would ride the same train. I had an unlimited Metro card that for me was the equivalent of an unlimited freedom that I held onto so tightly. I would offer swipes to people who were standing at turnstiles waiting for help. This made me think of my life back home and wish that someone could offer me a magical swipe every time I get stuck at a checkpoint. As I heard the subway announcement of the train stops on my last day in New York, I imagined Beit Natif, the village I come from, being one of those stops. On that day, I wrote a poem to honor that rare moment of hope and a newfound freedom. The poem goes, the next stop is Jaffa. The next stop is Jerusalem. The next stop is Beit Natif. This is the last stop on this train. Everyone, please leave the train. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Baha, for taking us on your story and the train journey. I will now give it to Ruti to facilitate Q&A.
Need to unmute. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much to all of you. I've heard several of these stories before, and each time it's like a gut punch. These are so powerful and remind me why we do this work, right? Why it is so important to not to give up. And I have to say, you know, we're all living in this crazy virtual reality, and in our those of us lucky enough to live in the safety of our own homes, and it's sometimes I forget, and this is really a powerful reminder of why we do what we do. And I just, each of your stories just is so deeply moving and so profound. So I want to open it up. If folks have any questions, please, you can put them in the chat or just raise your hand. There's a way to raise your hand or put them in the chat. But in the meantime, I want to actually take this opportunity. I know that Rowan and Anna and Maya have invited J Street to participate with them, to be a partner in their work next summer. And I was hoping that Rowan, that one of you could say a few words about that exciting partnership for next summer.
Maya, I'll let you take this one. Hi, everyone. My name is Maya, and I'm one of the staffers on New Story Leadership. So usually, as we said earlier today, New Story Leadership brings Israelis and Palestinians together to Washington, D.C. And a huge part of that program that they go through is learning about the American political system and understanding what impact they can have on our system by sharing their stories with politicians here in Washington, D.C. And as we're planning for this next summer, we know that we've been creating a network of the next leaders of Israel and Palestine. They're learning how to share their stories, and they're learning how to advocate for themselves. And we realized the next part of this is to add in the next American leaders. And so we've kindly asked J Street to help us in that mission, to bring together not only Israelis and Palestinians, but also that American idea and that next generation of American leaders to learn together how to share their stories, bring it to Capitol Hill, and start that next step in creating the future that we all want. So we're very excited to start the journey together and get our first cohort of the 3.
Thank you. Yes, I'm excited as well. As I didn't mention at the beginning, part of my work in the community, as part of my job in communal engagement, is that I also work with our advocacy core, which is our J Street's young adult platform. For those not familiar, for the ages 22 to 35. So we want to create a home for J Street U alum, as well as for folks, young adults who want to be involved in this work. And we, for example, today are having a phone happy hour / phone bank / watch party for the VP for the debate. So I'm excited that we'll be able to offer this opportunity for advocacy core members to be part of this amazing program. So I have here a question here from Andrea. How do you deal with the charge of normalization by sharing your stories together? Do you advocate for particular political positions? And I'll just put it, any of you want to chime in? Hadar, Doron, Baha, Mara. Does anyone want to take that? Or maybe Rowan or Maya?
I can add a little bit. I think with every initiative that tries to bring both the Palestinian and Jewish voices, the Israeli voices, would be like people would call us normalizing. For me, where I draw the line of normalization is if I don't get to express my voice, if I don't get to challenge the other person, then that for me falls as normalization. For me, normalization is basically trying to suppress each other's voices, and I don't think NSL does that. It's exactly the opposite. It's bringing us closer by speaking our differences and speaking our stories. But unfortunately, in the past few years, people are more and more using the word normalization without understanding what it means and without even considering the consequences of with tagging each other as normalizing, which is unfortunate.
Any of the other delegates want to chime in on that one? Thank you, Mara.
Yeah, adding to what Marah just said, I would also say that by definition, normalization means to normalize what is not normal. And I think within NSL, I don't think that any of that has ever happened. I feel like ever since I joined this program, I've been given opportunities that were never given to me before, especially the opportunity to actually raise my story, to share my story about Beit Natif, the place that I was displaced from in 1948. So I wonder, what is the relation between normalization and speaking this truth about my village of Beit Natif? And also, not only that, hearing also the perspectives of my fellow Israeli delegates regarding my story, who always supported me and listened to me attentively every time I shared that story. And for me, that's courage. It's not normalization.
I would also like to add to what's been said that from where I come from, normal is to enlist to the army and serve as a combat fighter when you're 18. And using violence to maintain peace is completely legitimate. And I don't think, like, if this is the definition of normal, then I'd rather be not normal.
Thank you. I'm not seeing, please, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. In the meantime, I want to take this opportunity to lift up the program generally. This is just really a terrific program, New Story Leadership, bringing Palestinians, Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians from the territories, bringing and Israeli Jews, and having this opportunity. I've heard a lot about programs that afford this. That it's hard to have, right, these really difficult conversations that you all have with each other. Unfortunately, you had to do this virtually, but generally here in the US, that you can have conversations that you cannot have in Israel and Palestine. It's just too fraught. And I'm curious, this is probably more a question for Maya and Anna and Rowan, if you can share maybe some highlights of what happens, the really unique and special moments that happen here on the ground when folks come together in the US, on the Hill, in the DMV. If you can share a few of, just to give people a higher resolution of how special this is, how unique.
Yeah, I can share. Well, I think the highlights, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of everyday moments that happen during the summer program where the delegates are, for the first time ever, on equal footing. They have the same US visa, there isn't othering, and they're in a place where both voices are heard loud and clear in the platforms that we give them. To me, I think one of the highlights would be during Advocacy Day on Capitol Hill. Every summer, we organize 30 to 40 meetings on the course of 2 days where our delegates share their stories with Congress members and senators. And the behind the scenes that happens before that, the delegates spend hours and hours together refining 30-second stories, because those of you that have done lobbying before know that you don't really have much time in a congressional office to share your story. So they're working together and they're thinking, okay, what's the message that I want to bring? I want the senator to understand the human cost of war for Israeli soldiers when they return and the PTSD that comes. I want the senator to understand what it's like every day on a checkpoint. And one of the meetings, we were with Senator Bernie Sanders, and our delegates shared their 30-second stories. One of the delegates, Nidal, shared that he was a nurse from Hebron, and while wearing his Red Cross uniform giving first aid, he was shot in the back by rubber bullets by an IDF soldier. And he told the senator, Senator Bernie Sanders, I want you to understand that medical staff need to be protected. And then Matan, our Israeli delegate, shared how her 18-year-old brother was sent to the Gaza war and came back with severe PTSD. She said, Senator, I need you to understand the human cost of war. And the senator looked at our delegates and called his chief of staff, Matthew Duss, all the staffers and the interns, and he told his staff, take notes, because these are the people, these are the young people we should be listening to. And he went to our delegates and said, what else do I need to know? And the 15-minute scheduled meeting turned into about an hour of our delegates just giving it to him. And he listened. And I think that's one of the highlights, just the ability to listen and to feel heard as a young Palestinian and a young Israeli, and the platform that gives you to feel like, I do have a voice. I think that's what's missing back home, because we don't have a voice with our leadership, and sometimes in majority of our societies. Maya or Anna, do you have any highlights that resonate with you that you'd like to share? We also have some board members, Ira, that's on the call too, if you'd like to share anything.
I'll just quickly say, I don't want to be too repetitive, but I would say the highlight is really, and it was for me too as a delegate, challenging the way that the conflict is discussed, because what you heard today and what we do every day is something that people don't really hear, and not just people on Capitol Hill. We do a lot of public events where we invite anybody who's interested in coming, and very often it's the first time people hear a story like that or just a different perspective. So to me, that's one of the most exciting and encouraging things. Maya, do you want to share something? Don't want to put you on the spot, but
I think Ira had his hand up too.
So I just want to congratulate you guys on another great program, but I do want to add just one word. I spent many years now teaching the two narratives of the history of the conflict. The narrative as it's taught in Israeli schools pretty much, and the narrative as it's taught in Palestinian schools pretty much. Here in America, I've taught it here to adults in America, it is extremely difficult for anyone brought up in one narrative to hear the other narrative and to actually listen. It's close to impossible. The stories that I have heard today are probably the most effective ways I've ever come across of getting across the other narrative to people who are brought up in one. And pretty much everybody in the United States and in Israel-Palestine is brought up with only one narrative. So I want to congratulate you guys. I think you really are breaking through a barrier that exists in 90% of the people's heads. And I think the way you guys do it, the stories you tell, do the job. And so thank you all.
Are we frozen? Can you hear me, everyone?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that.
Seems like maybe Richie, you're frozen. I'll just read one. One question came in for Hadar specifically. Let me find it. We'd love to hear a little bit more about the conversations, the hard conversations you've had with your family and community members in the settlement, and what that's been like and how you've been supported.
It's a great question, but I'm afraid that the answer is not so good. Basically, it always comes down to the same phrases, like over and over again. We deserve to be on this land because of the Bible. They have other 22 countries to go to. They are terrorists, like, doesn't matter if they are or they're not, like, they're all terrorists. We should all be afraid of any Arab that we meet. Like, and I would say that in my specific family, politics is rarely discussed. It's like, to my dad, it's like dropping a bomb. If I say politics, he's immediately shut down. My grandmother, when she used to, like, she was born in the United States and she made Aliyah. So she just tells me, you're a young girl, you don't know anything about anti-Semitism. And if you were living in a different place, you wouldn't be so sympathetic to the Palestinian narrative. So it's basically that, but most of the people that I know are absolutely avoiding this conversation because they know that once they get the information that I want to spread out, it will be almost impossible for them to hold on to the same views and beliefs that they have. So they are absolutely trying to avoid it.
Thank you, Hadar. Thank you, and thank you for sticking in, staying with it, even though this is so difficult. We are at time now, and I just wanted to, Rowan and Maya and Anna, if there's any last words you want to say before we leave our Sukkah.
Well, one, I'd like to thank everyone for having their lunch break or their noon time with us. And I would like all of you to remember that the stories that you heard today are stories that are in the hundreds and thousands and millions of experiences that Palestinians and Israelis face. And these personal stories, they are the politics that make up what's happening on the ground. So please take your stories with you and share them with your friends, your relatives, share them with your Congress members so they know that these stories are alive. And you may all shut this Zoom meeting, and me too, because I'm in the United States, and kind of go back about your everyday lives. But for people like, you know, Baha and Hadar and Marah and Daron, that is their lives, living in the region every single day. And the United States plays a huge role. The administration, Congress, they play a huge role in dictating the policies that are affecting their lives. So please take the personal stories into your political conversations. Please take their personal stories into your own personal advocacy so that the stories don't just stay here, but they move on and they're included in the conversation. And remember that the personal is political. That's my bit, and thank you for joining. If you do want to learn more about New Story Leadership, we linked our website in the chat box. So
put it in there one more time. Put it in there one more time, Rowan. Thank you so much, because I just want to say that Eva from the Bay Area is inviting you out there. So whatever that means, virtually, or eventually when we one day can see each other again in person. So I want to thank you from J Street and from Trua for being in our sukkah with us today, and for all of you and New Story Leadership being our guests, our Ushpizin, and for everyone here on this call for your courage and for staying with the fight for a better future for Israelis, for Palestinians, for all of us. So stay safe and be healthy, and may much change come on November 3rd, starting with November 3rd. All right. Thank you so much. I'm just leaving this open so people can copy down those links.